Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Bending and Breaking. I'm John, and today we're chatting with Peter Moore about how John Chrysostom and John Calvin, two really influential people in church history, preached in order to transform the hearer. Pete's a Presbyterian minister with 30 years of pastoral experience and with 15 years of experience in teaching in higher education. And his current ministry has an emphasis on personal formation of Christian leaders. And he does that through mentoring and training mentors and teaching pastoral leadership. He's a really experienced mentor, and I had the opportunity to do a lot of mentoring training with him in my studies. So if you're interested in contacting him, you can find him at idifica.com.au or on LinkedIn by searching Peter C. Moore, and I've got the links for you in the links to this episode. This was a pretty long interview, so I'm splitting it into two parts. The first one's a bit shorter. It just covers the really interesting lives of John Chrysostom and John Calvin. And then in the next episode, we'll dive into Pete's interesting theory on how preaching transforms the hearer. As always, the YouTube version has slides to help you get concepts that might be a bit tricky to understand. So hop on there if you're not quite following along. All right, let's jump in. Hi, Pete.
Hi, John.
Thanks for joining us on Bending and Breaking.
Oh, it's great to be here. I'm excited about it.
You wrote a thesis titled Gold Without Dross, an assessment of the debt to John Chrysostom in John Calvin's oratory. So that's what we're going to be talking to you about today. But before we dive... Yeah. So it took 10 years, I think, if I remember correctly.
2007, the middle of 2007 to the middle of 2013, so 6 years.
6 years. Oh, where did I get 10 from? I was sure it was 10. 6 years. That's still
it
long.
Looks like it's 10 years.
Yeah, 6 years is still a lot. Yeah, so that's probably longer than I've worked on anything in my life. So that's quite an achievement. But before we dive into the content of it, I think the title's great, but I just need to know what dross means.
Okay, so dross, when you're melting or smelting ore, dross is the kind of rubbish that comes out of the metal. And so it's about talking about using the parts of metal that is of value and gold, glittery and beautiful, and getting rid of the rubbish. So, and the idea here is that as John Calvin, who was this famous 16th century French preacher, as he read the sermons or homilies of John Chrysostom, who was a 4th century Greek preacher, he took the gold and got rid of the rubbish.
So Calvin's kind of got the refined version of Chrysostom's work.
Yeah, he was a kind of a theological smelter.
So for our audience, most people have probably heard of John Calvin, but never have heard of John Chrysostom. So could you tell us a bit about the two preachers that we're looking at? You mentioned John Chrysostom was 4th century.
Yes.
In a Greek culture. Could you tell us a bit more about that?
So in the 4th century, so he was born in, we're not quite sure when, maybe 345, 347. And he was born in an ancient Greek city called Antioch. Actually, that's the city that's referred to in the book of Acts as the first place that people were called Christians. So it was a very early Christian city, one of the first Gentile cities to be evangelized when the Gentile mission started, and the apostles went out. Paul went out with other apostles to preach the gospel. He was born there about 300 years later after that, and about 345, 347, and he was the son of a middle-class family. We don't know too much about his parents, but he was, as a middle-class boy, he was went to school, which in those days, schooling for boys, regrettably not for girls, but schooling for boys involved as an infant's child, you'd learn grammar, Greek grammar. So he was a native Greek speaker, but they still needed to work on their grammar because Greek grammar is quite complicated. And then in their teens, early teens, they went into a rhetorical school. So they learned how to be public speakers. And this was at the very heart of Greek education. And because all the leading people in a Greek city had to exercise influence through public speaking in the local forum and so forth, in the marketplace, in debates and so forth. And so that was the classic education. You'd be taught how to do public speaking, to prepare speeches, and also to do extemporary preaching or speaking, not preaching. I'm getting ahead of myself. He's not a Christian at this stage. And then you would also be taught how to write letters, which is really interesting. And so he grew up only probably, I don't know if it's about 100 kilometres from Tarsus, where Paul, the Apostle Paul, grew up. And I reckon that the Apostle Paul also had a rhetorical education because of the way I read him in his letters. He reads like a man who had been trained as an orator or as a persuader in one of those ancient schools. So that was Chrysostom. As a late teenager, he became a Christian. He left his rhetorical training and went to study with in a little Bible school in Antioch run by a guy called Diodor of Tarsus. So that's the same. He came from the same city as the Apostle Paul. And Diodor taught him how to read the Bible carefully. He was a really great Bible reader, Bible exegete, and he could really read the Bible and work out what it was meaning. And of course, these men were native Greek speakers, and so they could read the Greek New Testament much better than we can. And then Chrysostom, after being in that little Bible college for a little while, he went up onto Mount Sulpius, which is the mountain that overlooks Antioch. You can visit Antioch today. It's called Antakya in Turkey, and it's a beautiful place to visit, and they're wonderful people in Antakya. And on the mountain there, he joined a little colony of monks, I suppose you might say, and then for 2 years, and then he became a hermit monk himself and went off and just by himself for 2 years, memorising the Bible, the whole of the Bible in Greek. Now, of course, that's not as big a problem for him because he grew up in an oral culture, and of course he was a native Greek speaker anyway. And then he was so disciplined with his ascetical, self-denial practices that he actually made himself sick. And so eventually he had to come back. After 4 years, he had to come back to Antioch, and he became a deacon in the local church. And then he was presbytered and became a priest, eventually assistant bishop. And he preached as priest and assistant bishop for a number of years until he was abducted by one of the eunuchs of the imperial court, which was down in Constantinople. The Emperor Constantine had founded this new city, which he named after himself, of course. Constantinople just means the city of Constantine. And Chrysostom was such a respected preacher and Christian man. He was abducted by a eunuch from the imperial court and taken down to Constantinople, where he was forcibly ordained as the Archbishop of Constantinople. Now, the local people in Antioch loved John so much they would never have allowed him to go. So this was the only way that the emperor could get him down to Constantinople to be ordained as the Archbishop. But they were all very happy for him back in Antioch when they found out that he'd become the Archbishop of Constantinople. And if I can finish the story, he preached fearlessly there for a number of years, but because of his fearless and somewhat clumsy, he was politically clumsy, he upset the empress, Evdoxia or Eudoxia, we might say, reading it in English, but Evdoxia is how Greek people say it today. And she had her husband Arcadius, banish John into the more continental parts of Turkey. They were both Christians, by the way. the emperor and his wife, but you still had to be politically savvy to survive in Constantinople in those days, and he was banished into the interior. But he kept writing letters back to Constantinople, which was annoying the empress and the emperor, and so eventually some guards were bribed to take John on a forced march in the middle of winter in sub-zero temperatures, and he's in his let me think. He's approaching 70 or about 70 years of age, and they were told that if he died on the march, that they would be rewarded. And so he did die, and at least he caught a terminal case of pneumonia, and so they were rewarded. And John was martyred because of his fearless preaching of God's word.
Wow.
So it's kind of, the story ends well, doesn't it? Because that's the classic story of a faithful Bible man, a faithful gospel agent. So that's John Chrysostom.
Yeah, wow. That's such a rich life. I don't often, when I think about early church fathers, you might call them, Christian men and women, I often don't even think of a time when they would have not been Christian. I just assume they were always Christian and were always writing these treatises and that sort of thing. But he's got such a rich life. That's really interesting.
Yeah, it was. He was a real enthusiast. And of course, it was the quality of his life as well as the brilliance of his preaching that, as a Christian, that really impressed people and led to his influence. So of all the ancient preachers, John Calvin said he was the greatest of the ancient preachers, after the apostles, of course. And it was mainly because of his faithfulness as an expositor of the New Testament, his skill in reading the New Testament accurately, and also his skill in expounding that and preaching that and applying that to people's lives as a preacher. And the people loved public speaking as an art form in those days. And he certainly knew how to do the art. He was one of the greatest orators of his day, but he was also a Christian preacher. So he used that in service to the gospel, which was wonderful. And in fact, in the Orthodox churches, the Eastern churches today, John Chrysostom is one of the three authorized, most authoritative theologians. Let me see, Basil, Gregory, and John Chrysostom.
Right.
And so they've got these three great patriarchs or great ancient theologians in the Greek tradition, and he's one of the three. So they read, in the Greek church today, they would read John Chrysostom on the same level of authority as the Bible, actually. Now, we as Protestants wouldn't do that.
Yep.
But actually, when you read John Chrysostom, a lot of the time you're just reading the Bible anyway, because he's just expounding the scriptures and as a faithful preacher.
Let's hop over to John Calvin now, another John. So out of the two, this is probably the guy people are more familiar with, and probably most familiar with his works in the Institutes, and specifically maybe his thoughts around, I guess, what's now called Calvinism and might be summarized in that TULIP acronym. Can you tell us a bit more about John Calvin and why you suggest that his prime purpose wasn't as a writer of theology, but as a preacher?
Yeah. Well, yeah, thank you. Calvin was born in 1509 and he died in 1564. So he was only, let me see, that's 55, I guess, when he died, around about 55. He also actually had a very similar background to Chrysostom. He wasn't born as a pagan, but he was born in the sort of medieval Catholic Church, and he became a Christian. And he went to university. He studied in Paris, and he studied classical rhetoric, just like John Chrysostom did. He had a classical rhetorical education. He learnt from the ancient pagan manuals of oratory, how to persuade people by public speaking. But of course, in that time, he was influenced by the Latin tradition. So there was a whole heap of Roman orators who spoke Latin, and there was a Latin rhetorical tradition, whereas, of course, Chrysostom was alive at a time when the Christian world was basically Greek-speaking, and so he was in the Greek tradition. By the time of Calvin, the Christian world, at least in the Western Church, was Latin-speaking, and so it was a Latin rhetorical tradition. People like Cicero, who was a first-century orator. So that's how Calvin was trained, and he was studying law, which was essentially what the training that Chrysostom was getting too, because as an orator, you would then go into the public service of the empire, maybe in a legal role. That would have been John Chrysostom. It was similar for Calvin. He was being trained as a lawyer in the rhetorical tradition of his day, and but he became an evangelical, a Protestant, as a student at university, and he was a shy man. His first published work was a commentary on one of the Latin orators, Seneca's treatise on compassion or mercy, De Clementia, and Calvin wrote a commentary on that. He was a Christian when he published that in 1532, but he was not intending to be a pastor or a significant Christian leader. And then in 1536, he published his first edition of the Institutes of the Christian religion. Again, it's a fairly arid kind of academic work. He was not intending to be a pastor or a preacher at all at that time in his life. He was really more of wanted to be a scholar. But he was passing through Geneva in 1536, not long after his first edition of the Institutes, which was really tiny compared to the final edition. But he was passing through when William Farel, who was a reformer in Geneva, was having trouble in the very early days of the Reformation in Geneva. And when Farel recognised John Calvin as this young, shy student or scholar, as being the author of the Institutes, he thundered at him that he would be, rejected by God if he didn't use his gifts to, be cursed by God. He was basically calling down curses on Calvin if he didn't stay in Geneva and help with the Reformation project. And so poor old Calvin, who was timid by nature, decided to stay. Now, when he stayed initially, he did so with the intention of only being a kind of a scholarly academic kind of figure, maybe teaching the Bible in lectures. But after a few months, he was actually ordained as a pastor. And so that was his first stay in Geneva as a pastor. But in 1538, so that was from late 1536, in 1538, in Easter time, at Easter 1538, there was a great tumult in Geneva because Calvin had got so angry, along with Farel, about the unholy activities of people in the church. They decided on their own bat, without consulting the elders, because it was a Presbyterian setup with a bunch of elders and the local council of the city, but without consulting anyone else, they decided to excommunicate the whole city and not serve communion at Easter time. And as a result of that kind of young man's fiery boldness, he got ejected from Geneva, along with Farel. So Calvin went down to Strasbourg in that part of France, which is what they call Lorraine, and the Germans have occasionally been part of Germany when they called it Alsace. Anyway, Strasbourg is an equal German and French-speaking city, and he was pastoring a French-speaking congregation in Strasbourg. And it was there that he actually purchased a copy of Chrysostom's sermons, the complete homilies of John Chrysostom. And then about 3.5 years later, or 4 years later, in 1542, he was summoned back to Geneva by the city council. The city was virtually on its knees. The church was in tumult. The Reformation was almost at the point of falling over, and even people considering going back to the Roman faith. and they needed somebody who was gifted, clear thinking, highly intelligent to articulate and bring together the Reformation project. And there was only one man they knew that could do that. And so that was John Calvin. And so he was summoned back to Geneva in 1542. And for the next 10 or 15 years, he laboured there under great difficulty. He was not loved. People spat at him in the street. They called their dogs, their sort of mangy dogs, Calvin. He was not loved. But there was a turning point in the Reformation of the city after about 12 or 15 years. I can't remember the dates exactly. And from that turning point, the city settled down. And by the time he died, of course, he was a much loved pastor in the church. Now, in those years between 1542 and 1564, when he died, those 22 years, it was preaching which was his main concern. He invested almost all of his efforts in preaching. Now, he did revise. There were various editions in Latin and in French of the Institutes, and he polished that. He also wrote letters to other Reformation figures around Europe. And he did pastoral care of people as a pastor in Geneva. He visited people in prison and in hospital and in their homes. But his primary focus was on preaching. He, on average, every Sunday he preached morning and evening. And then 1 week he would preach 5 each weekday. He would preach a sermon. And then the other week he wouldn't preach on the weekdays. So that's, if you add it up, that's 9 sermons over a fortnight. So that's about an average of 4.5 sermons a week. So He spent a lot of time preparing preaching. Now, in this second ministry, he was successful, and he was able to get people on side and communicate. And people, the city was transformed morally and socially and culturally. It became a leading light of Christianity in the world. And the theory has been, well, what changed? Why was he such a failure in his first time, his first few years in Geneva, those first 2 years, and such a success in those other years? And people have wondered whether it was because he was reading Chrysostom when he was down in Strasbourg. And he'd actually learned how to preach more effectively. And so that's where my thesis comes in. I set out to compare Chrysostom's preaching and Calvin's preaching and seeing whether there's any evidence in the sermons of that influence. And to my satisfaction and to my examiner's satisfaction, I did prove that. I don't know whether anybody else would be convinced, but we were all convinced, and I got my PhD. Well, and learned a lot, but the main thing was I learned so much about effective preaching from these two guys. These two men, I've already told you that Chrysostom was one of the great three in the Eastern Church, so one of the most influential Christians in Eastern Christianity. And Calvin, you'd have to say something similar in Western Christianity.
Yeah, certainly.
Not in Catholicism, of course, but in Protestantism, his expository preaching style is virtually what we experience in evangelical churches. Now, I teach at the moment at Sydney Missionary and Bible College, and I'm a graduate of Moore Theological College and Christ College in Burwood. And in each of these three colleges, it's this expository preaching style that's taught, and that all comes from John Calvin. And my thesis at least demonstrates for my satisfaction that it previously came from, well, it was at least influenced by John Chrysostom, this great 4th century preacher.
And I guess Calvin's preaching style was, Calvin and Chrysostom's preaching style was then influenced by rhetoric in their own culture. By rhetorical, what's the word for it? Rhetorical
methods or techniques.
Methods, yeah.
Definitely.
I guess that's kind of like the starting point of your thesis. You kind of examine a bit of what rhetorical techniques are, and that was in your appendix a fair bit, which I found really interesting. Before we dive into that, it's really interesting to see how two people living what's that, like 1200 years apart, can have really parallel lives, both kind of growing up through with rhetorical training, both becoming Christians, I guess, both being moved around physically without their consent almost, or maybe that's more true for John Chrysostom, but Calvin to an extent as well was moved around without his maybe full will, or full complicit will. I don't know how you describe that.
Yeah. And was pressed upon to do things that would not have actually personally chosen.
Yeah.
That's absolutely, for sure.
Yeah, but then God uses them both to heavily influence the church in following years and for hundreds of years following. So let's start with that rhetorical training then. Okay, that was just a bit of background on the lives of John Chrysostom and John Calvin. In the next episode, we'll dive into what Pete discovered while he was studying their sermons and how they preached to transform the hearers.